Artificial intelligence is a new and exciting frontier in many industries, but there are some concerns about its impact on aspects of our society and, of course, livelihoods. On this episode of the Workers Podcast, we'll take a deeper look at some of these concerns. I have as my guest Michael Watt. He is an economist and specialist in the Workers' Activities Office of the ILO. Michael, I'm so happy to have you on our podcast.
Thank you very much, Anderson. Very, very happy to be here today. Hello to everyone.
Excellent. So I'll start off by asking you, just to give us some clarity and for the benefit of our audience, when we speak of AI, what exactly are we talking about and why has it seemed to become such a major topic in recent years?
No, certainly. And I think that's a very pertinent question because more often what we see is that under the term artificial intelligence, we tend to put all kind of new technological developments. However, of course, this is not necessarily the case.
Okay.
Artificial intelligence, I mean, it really one of the distinctive features is that really it involves computers learning and solving problems using a huge amount of data in order to train systems. We also talk often about machine learning, and there are some distinctions between this and other forms of artificial intelligence.
Mm-hmm.
But in principle, this is one of the sort of the key elements of it. It is also not particularly new as a term. I mean, you mentioned it. There's a general concern about artificial intelligence, but of course, this is something that has been discussed and circulated about since the 1950s.
Okay.
We've seen already, very sort of basic and neural systems and networks being established since basically the Second World War, all the way through the 1950s, 1960s. So it's not necessarily a new phenomenon. What is kind of new and why we are talking so much about it is, I think, very much due to the fact that new sort of computing powers and access to data, which is the underlying factor of all artificial intelligence and machine learning systems, has really exploded over the last few decades. So we have most data in the world has been generated over the last few years. And that has led to this huge increase and the speed in which we've seen some of these developments taking place. So for me, that's one of the first sort of elements of why we are talking about this, including on this podcast today. The second thing, of course, is that I think the application for the general public has increased quite considerably. We're all familiar with anything from what we now call large language models. Is the newer one, right? ChatGPT, and how this is changing, the way we work, the way we gather and we disseminate information, but also issues around Siri or Alexa. Some of these chatbots have been sort of part and parcel of everyone's lives, and I think it is a much more familiar concept now with a lot of people than maybe some of the previous technological advancements around AI have been. And then lastly, of course, this has led to what I would consider fairly sort of impactful headlines, I like to call them, in terms of this whole kind of automation of cognitive functions, which is what a lot of this technologies has now led to, is that we are, there are ongoing and increasing fears of humans being replaced by robots altogether. I think we're all familiar with some newspaper article, or we have a picture in our minds of robots essentially pushing out humans. And although I find a lot of this quite a little bit too much of a science fiction element to it, still it kind of raises a lot of concerns about autonomous decision making in particular. So there's a lot of new changes. There's a lot happening. However, it is very much, or it is very important to consider that this is technology and the development that is already at least 70, 80 years old.
Yes, thank you, Michael. So one of the things about artificial intelligence is that it's obvious that there are tremendous benefits. But if you can, could you dive deeper into some of the concerns about the implementation of AI in our lives and also as it relates to the world of work?
Sure, absolutely. I mean, the first main concern, as I've mentioned, is definitely in terms of displacement. So I think
Mhm.
there are a lot of people out there who hear about the abilities that AI have in terms of automating not just sort of repetitive tasks, like we've seen in the past. We've known robots in manufacturing and production processes for a few decades now, like in like in the car manufacturing industry. However, there's this new development of automation in terms of in terms of more complex tasks, I think is something that has that garners a lot of concerns. However, of course, this is nothing new. I think people have been scared about automation for as long as there has been technological innovation or as long as there have been industrial revolutions. And still, I think that the level of employment as a whole, of course, has not necessarily reduced. But still, what we see is that there always are transitions, which, as we know, have winners and losers. There are always sectors which are more at risk of being automated than others. So there are some genuine concerns when it comes to automation and the implementation of artificial intelligence. The second
Mhm.
big thing is, as I've mentioned before, is this idea of autonomous decision making. So
Mhm.
this is where, within the loop of decision making, as it were, humans are not in the loop, but they're outside of the loop. So you have
Mhm.
systems which are entirely autonomous and they make decisions which can have pretty devastating consequences for people. So here you can think of, for example, self-driving cars, where humans do not have any inputs in the decisions that a car may make. But you can also think, a bit more dramatically in terms of autonomous weapon systems, for example,
Mhm.
where targets are being acquired in an instant by some machine learning system and not by humans necessarily. Um, when it comes to the world of work, which of course is a very very important aspect for trade unions, this is also something that we're seeing seeping in a lot more into decision making processes at workplaces, and what we call algorithmic management. So employers and managers have a lot of more information on workers at their disposal, but they also have tools. So hiring and firing decisions are making more and more autonomously. We have HR departments where, for example, when you send your CV in, these CVs will not be scanned by a human, but they will be scanned by an AI system. Given a certain set of parameters, where they may sift through. You can tell the system choose the 10 best CVs
Mhm.
given these different parameters, or given the parameters of previous CVs which we have chosen, and the system will do that autonomously. So
Mhm.
chances are you will send your CV in, and it will never land on the desk of an actual human being to assess the goodness of fit as you as a candidate. Some of these
Mhm.
decisions can also be made in terms of firing. So this is where a lot of software that increases the ability for surveillance at the workplace come into play. We all use our phones for work. We all use our laptops. There's software which measures the amount of your mouse movements, how much you write. But
Wow.
it also can measure within the tone of your voice, and you have softwares that can then determine whether or not you're angry, or whether or not you're sad, or whether or not
Wow.
you're being aggressive. And for workers who work in call centers, for example, firing decisions can be made on the basis that a machine has thought that you were being too aggressive with a customer, for example.
Mhm.
And then, a manager still, even if a manager then comes in to fire you, the assessment of whether or not you've done your job well is being done by a machine and not by a
Mhm.
human being anymore. So there's a whole set of different concerns when it comes to these kind of decisions being made by machines, and also, and this is sort of the last point, is, as I said before, a lot of these AI systems do not function without data. And what we're seeing more and more is that a lot more data is being collected about workers at the workplace, but also about workers in the, within their general profile online. So managers potentially can buy data sets where your social media profile is being looked through. So I don't know, let's say you have liked a post of a certain political party, or you are openly active, activist, or you're openly a trade unionist on social media. This can be data that can be bundled and then sold to governments. It can be sold to employers, and they can make, potentially even fire you, given the fact that they do not wish to have somebody who may potentially unionize their workforce working for them. So there's a lot of concerns about data protection as well at the workplace when it comes to these data sets.
Wow. So now, what should workers make of all of this? And even more importantly, how should they navigate these developments and changes given the new technologies?
So, yeah, that's a very good question because, I mean, first of all, what I really try to kind of take away is this sort of idea that this is some exogenous factor, or this is something which basically happens to humans or happens to unionists, to workers, and there's nothing that can be necessarily done. And this is not necessarily the case. I do not believe that AI will render us all obsolete. I think we should give our human brains a lot of credit. We can, there's still, most new technologies are not necessarily replacing jobs altogether, but they are supplementing human activities. So we are not really faced with this idea that we're going to have mass layoffs or mass kind of unemployment due to the impact of artificial intelligence. But what is really important is that these transitions, so at the workplace, not necessarily at national level, but at the workplace, that when new artificial intelligence or new machine learning systems are being implemented, either in the production process or vis-a-vis the relationship between management and its workers, that this is done on some level of collective bargaining and social dialogue. So I'm not saying unions have to go out there and they all have to become IT specialists and understand what's happening at the back end of these softwares, but they have to understand the consequences when employers are actually implementing some of these softwares. And I can assure you that in a lot of instances, employers are not necessarily that aware of what they're actually implementing themselves. In most cases, when the HR department, for example, is implementing AI, it's not the company itself that has generated the software. They've bought it from some third-party provider. So once they have done so, it is very, very important that collective bargaining and social dialogue is at the basis to make sure that when the software is implemented at the workplace, that it is not done in a way that it is infringing on workers' rights. You as the union, you as the worker need to know exactly what kind of data is collected about workers at the workplace. You have to know where the data is being stored, whether this is secure or this can be actually sold to third-party providers. You have to be aware of what is actually being used by these for machine learning system purposes. Is it for surveillance? Is it for HR, for facilitating hiring processes? You have to be aware of in what capacity this kind of these machine learning systems are being implemented. So there has to be some level of co-governance between trade unions and workers and employers at the workplace to do that. So this is at the workplace level. At the national level, of course, trade unions, as often the largest voice and the most representative voice within civil society, have to hold their governments to account to ensure that there is some level of legislation when it comes to data protection and when it comes to the use of AI. And here, unfortunately, we see that technological advancements are often too fast for legislation to keep up. Nonetheless, they are, we are basically at the beginning at regional and at international level to come up with some level of legislations and also of guidelines, of course. The UN General Assembly just earlier this year has actually adopted its first resolution on artificial intelligence. And while it is non-binding, still it gives a lot of guidelines in how governments and how countries should kind of respond to some of these technological advancements. Another good example is the EU at the European level has its own AI directive again from this year. And the idea for all of them is a little bit the same. It is very much to ensure that humans remain still in the loop of decision making, so you don't have fully autonomous systems, and also that there's some level of guidelines in terms of the accountability of what happens when an AI system makes a decision. A classic example is, if you have a self-driving car and the software makes a decision that results in a death or in an accident, who is at fault there? Can you still, hold the driver to account if the machine has made the system without the driver's input? Can you hold the engineer or the company into account that has built the car in the first place? These are fairly profound ethical questions that need some level of guidance. And of course, it is also up to unions to hold their governments to account in order to establish some of these legislations. This cannot be something that remains in the hand of the private sector. We need legislation in order to provide some level of guidelines and living playing fields for technological companies to operate.
Excellent. And what's resonating with me, and of course I'm sure audience, is the call for awareness and involvement of unions and workers at multiple levels in this, as we see about the governance of the implementation of artificial intelligence technologies. Correct?
Yes, indeed. It is not just a matter of it is not just a matter of global trends or global developments that only necessarily affect the technological sector. This is something which will be impacting most workplaces, particularly in service economies, in some form or another. So to ensure and to put pressure that legislation is keeping up with technical advancements, but also to ensure that at shop level, at company level, unions and workers' representatives are aware of the potential changes that are impacting workers is hugely important. And again,
Absolutely.
social dialogue and collective bargaining needs to be the basis for implementation of new technologies, and also for lifelong learning and on the job training facilities as well. What we call the half-life of knowledge. What we learn at school is becoming more and more obsolete to a certain degree, which then requires lifelong learning strategies. It requires more on-the-job training. Now, how this is being implemented again needs to be on the basis of collective agreements, because it cannot be just the responsibility of the worker in its own time or within their own means to actually to invest in upskilling in that regard. This has to be something where workers, organizations, employers, and governments go hand in hand in establishing lifelong learning strategies. So this is very, very important.
Indeed. Now, my next question, you may have touched on it a bit, but are there any groups of workers that would be disproportionately impacted or affected by the implementation of AI?
Yes, and as I said, this is changing constantly, and this is there's a certain change to how technological innovation has kind of replaced workers in the past. I mean, automation has been around since the first industrial revolution. I mean, that's where the term Luddites comes from. There was this huge, in British factories in the 19th century, workers came together to start destroying machines because they feared that they were being replaced. So this whole idea about replacement and automation is nothing necessarily new. But whereas in the past, this was mainly affecting blue collar workers, it was affecting repetitive tasks for low and medium skilled workers. What we're seeing now with artificial intelligence is that this has a huge impact also on more cognitive tasks. So we see AI, machine learning systems, for example, threatening translation services, secretarial services, even programmers can be automated. Automated. We know of machine learning systems in the health sector, for example, who can scan, who can analyze CT scans of lungs to search for cancerous cells, and they are much more accurate and effective than doctors are, for example. So all of a sudden, even high skilled workers such as doctors can see at least part of their work being automated. But this is a little bit the clue. As much as, of course, AI may replace entire occupations, what we see, what it is doing and will do in future, it is actually replacing individual tasks. It is not making an entire occupation necessarily obsolete. So what we talk about, we talk about AI being job enhancing rather than job destroying, and this is the case for a lot of occupations as well. So again, some parts within service economies, in legal professions, secretarial work, translation work, there we see potential for job displacement over the next few years. However, there are a lot of other jobs where we see this is actually increasing the level of productivity, and as always, technological innovation are also creating entirely new jobs. Now, from a union perspective, what is of course important to consider is that these new jobs should be as protected and as unionized as the old jobs.
Yes.
So what we see often is that technological innovations tends to destroy jobs in unionized sectors and industries, and tends to create them in those where we have decent work deficits, where the level of unionization tends to be fairly low. So this is definitely something. Oh, excuse me. This is definitely something that we need to consider, and unions need to consider as well. That the tools that unions have at their disposal in terms of campaigning, organizing new workers or workers in new forms of new sectors or new forms of work are not necessarily new. However, efforts in order to reach out to workers which may not be traditionally part of the membership of unions is getting increasingly important, particularly because in a lot of regions of the world, unionization and union density rates are also decreasing. So from a union perspective, it is very, very important, not to consider this as AI, as a job displacement tool as a whole, but of course, for unions to be in a position to actually help in terms of making sure that the transition from older obsolete technologies to new technologies is not at the detriment of workers' rights and working conditions.
Certainly. Now I'll come to something you touched on a bit earlier. You mentioned the UN General Assembly resolution on AI, but tell us more about what exists as far as guiding principles for employers, government, societies, as far as adopting artificial intelligence and machine learning.
Sure, indeed. I mean, there's a lot of efforts, particularly at national level, of course, in order to keep up with the fast-paced advancements on AI system. And at international regional level, these are some of what I've mentioned previously are some of the newest developments, and a lot of it has happened this year. Okay. So we have this UN resolution. We also have at UN level the UN Digital Compact, which is a huge part of the Summit for the Future, which will happen later this year in September, and where a lot of the potential legislation and regulations around artificial intelligence will be discussed. But in terms of existing legislation, as far as I know, the only thing at regional or at sort of supranational level that exists is indeed the AI directive. So the EU only very recently has adopted that directive, which tries to provide some standards in terms of legislating AI systems. Again, with this idea that we mustn't necessarily create technology which is fully autonomous when it comes to decision making, and where sort of the level of accountability is somewhat regulated. So at least at that level, this is as far as I understand, still the only levels of legislation. Of course, the United States is working on their own set of legislation, as are individual countries, the United Kingdom as well. So I think most governments at this point have awakened to kind of this fast-paced developments and engaging as such. When it comes to data protection as well, there's again at EU level we have the UN GDPR, of course. So at European level, there's sets of data protection. Most national countries have some legislation on data protection. However, in some countries, these do not necessarily extend to workers and workplaces. So again, for unions, it is very, very important to consider, to engage with your respective governments to see to what extent data protection legislation at national level in the Caribbean region are actually covering workplaces and the data collected there. And in order to push and to put pressure on governments to engage in that. This is very much of concern, the level of information that employers are collecting about workers, and something that needs to be addressed accordingly.
Absolutely. Now, Michael, as we wind down and we come away from this discussion, what are some of the key thoughts that workers should bear in mind about artificial intelligence and machine learning?
Again, to kind of summarize maybe a little bit, is to really address or approach this particular topic with open eyes to a certain degree. I'm not here to advocate in any shape or form for being, for trying to prevent the implementation of new technologies, because also this is obsolete. I think AI, machine learning systems are here to stay. This is not something that is necessarily part of the discussion in what way we can prevent the implementation of machine learning systems and artificial intelligence. However, there are limitations to how much AI can actually do and implement, and how much they are shaping the world of work. I do believe that I think these concerns that we will all be out of a job by next week is to a certain degree overblown. But there are some concerns in terms of transitions, in terms of individual sectors, in terms of how much it will increase inequalities in the world. So unions have to be very much aware and move away a little bit of this idea that robots and AI is something that will change the world by tomorrow, and of which we have no control. And in doing so, they have to be very much aware and have to be educated in the sense, or workers have to be educated through unions in the sense of what are the very, very concrete workplace changes that artificial systems and algorithmic management can have on their respective workplaces in their respective sectors. So education from a union perspective is hugely important in that regard. And then to be at the table, to fight, to campaign, to advocate for social dialogue and for collective bargaining, to be really at the heart of decision making in terms of how artificial intelligence and machine learning systems are being implemented in your respective countries and in your respective workplaces. So approach AI with an open mind, as it were, with a healthy dose of skepticism, but really to try and understand the implications, in a very granular manner, and demand that you, as the representatives of the labor movement of workers for the Caribbean, are part of the decision-making processes of implementing artificial intelligence is hugely important.
Absolutely. Michael, I want to thank you so much for your time and your insight into this subject.
No, it's my pleasure. Thank you very, very much for having me and giving me this opportunity to speak to you all today. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Again, we were speaking with Michael Watt, an economist and specialist in the Workers' Activities Office of the ILO. Do remember to join us every Friday. We upload a new video on our YouTube channel. You've been watching and listening to the Workers Podcast. Thank you again for joining us.